There's been a lot of time and money spent indoctrinating Australia's youth into the cult of socialism. I mean, whichever ism you want to pick, there's a lot of isms running around, but they are being indoctrinated to one or more of them. Now, these kids have grown up and now they're starting to vote. We're seeing the results coming through in these inner city areas, and soon they'll be old enough to run companies and enter politics. Now, this happened under the watch of conservative governments, because in the States and federally we've had conservative Liberal governments in the majority of this for at least 10 years, and they've done very little to keep an eye on the education of our children, even though they had the power to fix these problems. I mean, what is the Liberal Party going to do? Because at the moment it seems they've failed to safeguard Australia's future by offering a decent education to kids. I mean, I know Labor wants to control the youth, but surely the Liberals have dropped the ball here.
Look, it's intentional. I don't think this is something that's happened by accident. The march, as it's called, through the institutions, they've tried to take over these institutions deliberately to create this outcome. So in any democracy, you're only going to get outcomes as good as the people participating within that system. So if there's a moral or other deficit in the people, you're going to see that over time that's going to create major issues. So I still believe when you compare it to the political class, the average Australian has better judgment, good judgment, decency, and common sense than the average person who's, and there are exceptions. There are some good people in politics, but as a class, as a whole, I think that most Australians have a better sense of common sense. So what we need to make sure is that we are not neglecting the education system and other areas that are bringing up the next generation. We need to make sure that the quality of people who are going to feed into that system are better. And perhaps there are some broader reforms that we can look at which would lead to better people being in Parliament and seeing that talent rise to the top, because that's not occurring at the moment.
Oh, look, I just don't have any faith that Liberals have got enough of a spine to take on the education unions and say, look, you've got to stop preaching this crazy stuff in our classroom because our kids can't add and they can't spell and they're falling off the world stage. I mean, we're behind some third world countries now with our literacy skills. I mean, how does that happen in a generation? It seems to be extraordinary. But going back to the monarchy for a second, spirituality is a big part of the service that you talked about. I mean, if you look at the late Queen Elizabeth, her faith and her spiritual guidance is part of the reason why she was such a wonderful monarch for all those years. Now, I'm not religious, but the lack of faith and what would you call it, general morals and culture among the youth has been replaced by political movements instead of spiritual movements. Now, we've got things like Extinction Rebellion, for instance, that brand themselves like a religion. Is this going to change the way that Australians grow up? Because you said, oh, they'll start voting Conservative when they get older, but I'm not so sure that the youth are going to behave like the youth of old because they're not tied down by the same principles as former generations.